I didn't slam the document on the mahogany table. That implies emotion. I simply slid the folder across the polished surface until it rested directly in front of him. The boardroom was silent, save for the low, vibrating hum coming from the chests of the 12 men surrounding me. They weren't just executives. They were apex predators in Italian suits. At the head of the table sat Kaelen Thorne, CEO of Thorne Dynamics and the alpha king of the regional pack. He looked at the paper, then up at me with predatory amusement. I checked my watch. "Your quarterly metrics are failing, Mr. Thorne. You're fired." Most people would be terrified of the sensory environment in this room. It wasn't just expensive cologne and stale coffee. It was the sharp metallic tang of ozone and the heavy musk of aggression. To a civilian, it triggers a flight response. To me, it just smelled like poor ventilation and unchecked ego. I stood at the foot of the table, smoothing the lapel of my blazer. My tablet displayed the grim reality of their financials, a sea of red ink that no amount of posturing could intimidate into the black. The board members shifted in their leather chairs. A massive man to my left, the VP of Operations, let out a sound that was less of a cough and more of a warning snarl. I didn't look at him. My focus was entirely on Kaelen. He hadn't touched the termination notice. He was leaning back, his dark eyes tracking my pulse point like it was a ticker tape. He expected me to flinch. He expected the biological pressure of being the only human in a room full of wolves to force a submission. "You can't fire the alpha," the VP growled, slamming a fist onto the table. The wood groaned under the impact. I tapped my screen, bringing up a projection of the bylaws. Actually, under Article 4, Section C of the merger agreement, the acquiring firm retains the right to restructure leadership in the event of gross fiscal negligence. You've lost 40% of your market share in 2 quarters. That isn't leadership. That's a hemorrhage. Kaelen finally moved. He didn't look at the projection. He picked up the termination notice, read the first line, and then slowly, deliberately, tore it in half. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. He dropped the pieces onto the floor and smirked. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the look of a wolf who had just realized the rabbit had walked into the den willingly. "Leave us," Kaelen said. His voice was low, a rumble that you felt in your sternum rather than heard with your ears. The other executives hesitated. The VP looked ready to argue, his eyes flashing a bright, unnatural amber, but Kaelen didn't repeat himself. He just tilted his head slightly to the side. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. The dominance was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on everyone but him. One by one, the board members stood up, straightened their ties, and filed out of the room. They didn't look at me as they passed. They looked like men fleeing a blast zone. When the heavy double doors clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier this time. I was alone with the Alpha King. I analyzed the tactical situation. He was physically superior in every metric: speed, strength, sensory input. But we weren't in a forest. We were in a Class A office building in downtown Manhattan. Here, leverage wasn't determined by who had the sharpest teeth, but by who controlled the assets. And right now, I owned his debt. "You have a very dangerous misunderstanding of how this pack operates," Kaelen said, standing up. He was taller than the biodata suggested. He moved around the table with a fluid, predatory grace that made the expensive suit look like a costume. "You think a piece of paper changes who runs this territory?" "I think your creditors don't care about your territory," I replied, keeping my voice level. "I'm here to salvage a merger, Mr. Thorne, not navigate your internal hierarchy. If you refuse to step down, I will freeze your accounts by noon." He stopped a foot away from me. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace of supernatural energy. He was trying to flood my senses, to overload my logical processing with raw instinct. It was a crude negotiation tactic. "You aren't freezing anything," he murmured, leaning down until we were eye level. "You walked into my house, threatened my position, and insulted my pack." "I audited your pack," I corrected. "There's a difference." He chuckled, a dark sound that vibrated against my ribs. Then I heard a distinct mechanical click from the entry. The electronic locks on the boardroom doors had engaged. The red security light blinked on. We were sealed in. I didn't rattle the handle or pound on the glass. That is what prey does, and despite the biological disadvantage, I refused to classify myself as part of the food chain. I simply turned back to the table, placed my tablet on the mahogany surface, and crossed my arms. Panic is an inefficient use of glucose, and right now, I needed every neuron firing to dismantle the creature standing in front of me. Kidnapping a federal auditor is a felony, Mr. Thorne, I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the sealed room. Even for a sovereign entity like the Thorne Pack, the SEC doesn't care about your full moon rituals. Kaelen didn't look worried. He looked satisfied. He tapped the surface of the conference table, and a holographic display flickered to life between us. It wasn't the financial report I had been presenting. It was the merger contract, specifically the appendices that most legal teams skim over because they assume it's boilerplate compliance jargon. You read the financials, Kaelen said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with that irritating alpha frequency designed to compel obedience. But you didn't read the fine print on the asset allocation. Page 412, the asset retention clause. I frowned, pulling the document up on my own screen. I scrolled past the environmental impact statements and the territory zoning laws until I found it. Subsection 9, biological continuity and key personnel integration. The language was dense, deliberately obfuscated by archaic legal phrasing. It stated that in the event of a biological resonance event, identified by the acting CEO, the acquiring firm, my firm, agreed to the immediate and irrevocable transfer of the compatible individual to the Thorne estate for the duration of the transition period. I stopped reading and looked up. This is nonsense. Biological resonance isn't a legal term. It sounds like a marketing buzzword for a new perfume. It's the legal definition of a mate bond under the 1993 Treaty of Species Integration, Kaelen corrected smoothly. He walked around the table, closing the distance between us. The air grew heavier, charged with static electricity. You aren't just the auditor anymore. According to that contract, which your firm signed, you are a key biological asset. You belong to the acquisition. I felt a spike of adrenaline, but I suppressed it. You're telling me that this merger includes a clause that allows you to claim a human woman as corporate property because you, what, smelled something you liked? It's not about what I like. It's about what is required, he said, stopping inches from me. He didn't touch me, but the heat radiating from his body was suffocating. My wolf recognizes you. That makes you essential to the pack's stability. If you leave this building before the integration is complete, you violate the contract. The merger voids. The financing collapses. Both our companies go into immediate bankruptcy. I stared at him, processing the data. He had checkmated me. Not with violence, but with bureaucracy. If I walked out that door, I destroyed my own firm. He had weaponized his own biology to lock me into a negotiation I couldn't exit. This is a hostile work environment, I said, my voice cold. I will file a grievance with the Department of Labor. You can file whatever you want, Kaelen replied, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. But until the audit is finished and the bond is stabilized, you aren't leaving the den. You're living here. I looked at the red light on the door, then back at the Alpha King. He expected me to cry or scream. Instead, I picked up my stylus. Fine, I said. If I'm stuck here, I'm not doing it as your prisoner. I'm doing it as a consultant. And my hourly rate just tripled. My relocation to the den, the colloquial term for the Thorne Dynamics headquarters, was completed with surprising speed. Kaelen's assistants, a pair of nervous betas, moved my workstation from the uptown office to this concrete fortress in under 2 hours. They evidently feared their alpha's impatience more than they feared a slip disc. The office assigned to me was a glass-walled enclosure in the center of the operational floor. It offered zero privacy. This was a tactical choice on Kaelen's part. He wanted the pack to see the human outsider, and he wanted me to feel the constant weight of their observation. It was designed to induce paranoia. I simply viewed it as an opportunity for direct oversight. And what I saw was horrifying. Thorne Dynamics didn't run on standard operating procedures. It ran on a feudal system of dominance hierarchies that made no sense for a modern conglomerate. Promotions weren't based on merit or KPIs. They were based on who could win a sparring match in the gym downstairs. This resulted in a head of human resources who had zero empathy but a terrifying right hook, and a director of logistics who couldn't navigate a spreadsheet but could track a delivery truck by scent across 3 counties. The most egregious violation of corporate sanity was the entire IT department. I went down on my first morning to secure my network credentials. The server room was dark, kept at a temperature that suggested they were storing meat rather than data. The systems administrator was a Delta named Marcus. When I entered, he wasn't coding. He was perched on top of a server rack, dismantling a hard drive with his teeth. "I need administrative access to the central node," I said, standing in the doorway with my clipboard. Marcus dropped the mangled metal components and looked at me with glowing yellow eyes. He growled, a low sound meant to establish territory. "I don't have time for the posturing, Marcus," I said, checking the inventory list on my tablet. "You're consuming company hardware. That's a write-off I have to justify. Give me the password or I lock you out of the cafeteria system. No more Steak Tuesdays." The growl cut off instantly. He dropped from the ceiling, typed the code into my tablet, and scurried back into the shadows. It was pathetic, but efficient. I returned to my glass bowl and began the arduous process of digitizing their records. They had no digital paper trail for decisions, only verbal orders given by alphas to subordinates. It was a liability nightmare. I was 3 hours into building a new organizational chart when the air pressure in the room shifted. I didn't need to look up to know Kaelen was there. "You're disrupting the pack dynamic," Kaelen said. He didn't sit. He stood directly behind my chair, leaning over my shoulder to look at the screen. His proximity was a calculated distraction, a wall of heat and cedar scent designed to break my concentration. "I'm disrupting a chaotic mess," I replied, not turning around. I highlighted a section of the chart in red. "You have a gamma running your acquisitions department. He's illiterate in 3 of the languages you do business in, but you keep him there because he's your cousin." "He's loyal," Kaelen rumbled, his breath stirring the hair near my ear. "Loyalty is the currency of the pack." "Loyalty doesn't read contracts, Kaelen. It just signs bad ones." I finally spun my chair around to face him. He was too close, his hands gripping the armrests of my chair, effectively trapping me. This was the competence friction. He was irritated by my defiance, yes, but I could see the dilation in his pupils, the slight flare of his nostrils. He wasn't just angry, he was stimulated. My authority over his chaotic world was triggering a response he hadn't anticipated. He expected a submissive mate. He got a chief operating officer. "You think you can tame wolves with spreadsheets?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I don't need to tame them," I said, meeting his gaze with clinical detachment. "I just need to make them profitable. Now, unless you have a relevant operational query, you're blocking my light." He stared at me for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw ticking. Then, surprisingly, he smirked, a sharp, acknowledging expression, and pushed off the chair. He walked away without a word, leaving the glass door open. I turned back to the screen, my heart rate slightly elevated, but my focus unbroken. I ran a query on the security logs for the loading dock, looking for efficiency gaps. That's when I saw it. A series of unauthorized entries at 3 a.m., flagged as maintenance, but lasting only minutes. Someone was bypassing the Delta at the gate, and they were using an override code that belonged to a dead man. I attempted to leave the glass office to investigate the security discrepancy I had flagged in the logs, but I immediately encountered a new operational hurdle. Kaelen Thorne had apparently decided that the asset retention clause required active physical enforcement. He began shadowing me. He didn't do it with the subtle discretion of a bodyguard. He did it with the overwhelming presence of a natural disaster waiting to happen. If I walked to the archives, he was there, leaning against the filing cabinets, watching my hands. If I went to the break room to source caffeine, he was standing by the machine, his dark eyes tracking every movement, as if I were about to escape through the ventilation ducts. "This is an inefficient use of executive time," I told him, not looking up from my clipboard as I walked down the corridor. "Don't you have a pack to lead? Or perhaps a deer to chase? Security is the Alpha's primary directive, he countered, matching my pace effortlessly. His stride was long, predatory, and silent. You are a high-value target now. The merger put a target on your back. The only target on my back is the one you're burning there with your eyes, I muttered. We stepped into the elevator together, heading down to the sub-basement levels where the physical logs were stored. The doors slid shut, sealing us in a 6x6 steel box. I pulled out my tablet, focusing on a spreadsheet detailing the depreciation of their heavy machinery. I needed numbers to drown out the sound of his breathing. You're nervous, Kaelen murmured. He didn't stay in his corner. He moved to the center of the car, invading my personal space. The scent of cedar and rain, ridiculously cliché, yet annoyingly pleasant, filled the small cabin. I am analyzing data, I corrected, staring at the screen until the pixels blurred. And you are crowding the consultant. It's bad for productivity. He chuckled, a low sound that I felt in my shoes. He stepped closer, his chest brushing my shoulder, his hands coming up to rest on the wall beside my head, effectively boxing me in. My wolf doesn't care about your productivity. He wants to know why you smell like fear. I snapped. I spun around, wielding my silver laser pointer like a weapon. I pressed the end of it firmly into the center of his chest, holding him back. No, I said, my voice sharp and authoritative. I am not afraid. I am annoyed. There is a difference. You are accustomed to people shrinking when you step close. I don't shrink, Mr. Thorne. I audit. Now back up. Give me 3 feet of clearance, or I will add a harassment suit to the pile of legal issues drowning this company. He looked down at the laser pointer digging into his expensive suit, then up at my eyes. For a second, the amber light in his irises flared, the beast challenging the command. But he didn't growl. He stepped back. He respected the boundary, not because I was strong, but because I was unyielding. That was when the realization hit me. He wasn't hovering over me to intimidate me. He was hovering because he was terrified of what I would find in those logs. His aggression wasn't predatory. It was defensive. He knew the company was rotting from the inside, and he was terrified that the woman he was bonded to would realize he was a failure of a king. The elevator chimed, breaking the tension. The doors opened to the sub-basement. Stay behind me, Kaelen ordered, his voice shifting instantly from seductive to soldier. He sensed it before I did. I looked past him. At the end of the corridor, near the server room, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It wasn't a maintenance worker. It was a wolf, mid-shift, claws extended, waiting for us. The shadow at the end of the corridor didn't lunge for my throat. That would have been a direct engagement, a tactical error against an alpha of Kaelen's caliber. Instead, the figure slashed its claws through the hydraulic lines of the massive industrial cooling unit suspended directly above the walkway. The sound was the first warning, a high-pitched hiss of escaping pressure, followed by the groan of shearing metal. I looked up, my brain calculating the trajectory of the falling machinery. It was a 10-ton block of steel and coolant, and I was standing in the center of the kill zone. The physics were absolute. I had less than a second to move, and human reflexes were insufficient for the velocity of the descent. I didn't scream. I simply braced for the termination of the contract. Then the world blurred. It wasn't movement as I understood it. It was a displacement of air, a violent shove that sent me skidding across the concrete floor. There was a deafening crash that shook the foundation of the building, a sound so loud it was felt in the teeth. Dust and debris exploded outward, coating the sub-basement in a gray choke. I coughed, waving the particulate matter away from my face, and looked up. Kaelen was crouching where I had been standing a microsecond ago. He was on one knee, his suit jacket strained across his back, holding the 10-ton cooling unit up with one hand. The concrete beneath his feet had spiderwebbed into a crater from the force of the impact. He wasn't even straining. He snarled at the darkness where the saboteur had vanished, then tossed the machinery aside as if it were made of cardboard. It crashed into the wall, destroying a row of conduit pipes. He was at my side instantly, his hands gripping my shoulders, his eyes wild and glowing with that unnatural amber light. "Are you damaged?" he demanded, his voice a guttural roar. "Did he touch you?" I slapped his hands away and scrambled to my feet, dusting off my blazer. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but the adrenaline didn't manifest as fear. It manifested as fury. "That unit was not scheduled for maintenance," I shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the wreckage. "Do you realize the liability exposure here? If that coolant had ruptured, we would be looking at an EPA violation that would bankrupt the subsidiary." Kaelen stared at me, his chest heaving. The beast was close to the surface, ready to hunt. But my reaction caused him to pause. "I just saved your life," he growled, incredulous. "And you are worried about the EPA?" "I am worried about operational negligence," I snapped, marching toward the ruined machine. "That wasn't an accident. That was a targeted failure. Someone bypassed the safety locks." "I know it wasn't an accident," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet. "It was an act of war. I will find him. I will tear his throat out in the lobby." "No," I ordered, spinning around to face him. "You will not. We are not resolving this with teeth, Kaelen. If you murder a staff member in the lobby, the stock price drops 40 points. We handle this legally." "Legally?" He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Someone just tried to crush you with a generator. This is pack business." "This is company property," I countered. I pulled a diagnostic tool from my pocket, standard carry for site inspections, and jammed it into the data port of the cooling unit's control panel, which was, miraculously, still intact on the side of the wreckage. The saboteur made a mistake. He didn't just use claws. He used an override code to release the hydraulic clamps. Claws don't leave a paper trail. Digital codes do. Kaelen paced behind me, the energy radiating off him making the hair on my neck stand up. He wanted blood. I wanted data. "The system is encrypted," I muttered, typing furiously. "But the user didn't clear the cache." "It smells like sulfur and cheap cologne," Kaelen said, sniffing the air near the cut lines. "It's a hired claw, a mercenary." "Maybe the muscle was hired," I said, watching the codes scroll across the small screen. "But the access credentials used to unlock the clamps, these belong to an executive-level account." The screen flashed green. Access granted. The user ID stared back at me. It wasn't a rogue element. It wasn't an external threat. "It's Silas," I said, the name tasting like ash. "Your CFO, the one who has been blocking the audit since day one." Kaelen stopped pacing. The growl died in his throat, replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. Silas wasn't just an employee. In the pack hierarchy, he was family. "Show me," Kaelen commanded. I turned the screen toward him. "He didn't just try to kill me, Kaelen. He tried to destroy the auditor that threatens his embezzlement scheme. This isn't a challenge for dominance. It's a cover-up." I didn't leave the building. The concept of going home seemed irrelevant when the person trying to bankrupt the company, and apparently flatten me with industrial machinery, was sitting in the C-suite. I barricaded myself in the glass office, pulled the blinds for the first time, and initiated a deep-dive forensic audit of Silas's personal accounts. The encryption was sophisticated, likely purchased from a black market broker, but it was built on the logic algorithm, and logic is my native language. By 3 a.m., my eyes felt like they were filled with sand. The only light came from the triple monitors humming on my desk. I was deep in a subdirectory of a shell company when the door opened. I didn't flinch. I knew it was Kaelen. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the desk and slid a porcelain plate over the spread of financial printouts. On it sat a steak. It was massive, beautifully cut, and almost entirely raw. It was blue in culinary terms. To me, it looked like a crime scene. "Eat," he commanded, leaning against the edge of the desk. He had discarded his suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they could snap a steel beam. "You're running on empty. You smell like exhaustion and stale caffeine." I looked at the meat, then up at him. "I appreciate the gesture, Kaelen, but I don't need anything that might still have a pulse. I need coffee. Black. High viscosity." "Coffee is a stimulant. Protein is fuel," he argued, pushing the plate closer. "You are too thin. In the pack, this would be considered a sign of weakness. A leader must look like they can survive the winter." I don't need to survive the winter, I countered, pushing the plate back until it was in neutral territory. I need to survive the fiscal quarter. And in my world, strength isn't measured by muscle mass. It's measured by leverage. He stared at me, the amber in his eyes softening slightly. He didn't force the food. He reached out and took a sip of my cold, sludge-like coffee, grimacing at the taste. You think my way is barbaric. I think your way is outdated, I said honestly. You run this company like a wolf pack. The strongest rules. Dissent is crushed. But money doesn't respect strength, Kaelen. It respects stability. Silas exploited that. He knew you wouldn't look at the spreadsheets because you were too busy watching the perimeter. Kaelen went silent. He looked out the glass walls at the darkened operational floor. For the first time, the arrogance cracked. His shoulders slumped, just a fraction of an inch. But on a man of his posture, it looked like a collapse. The pack is broke, he said quietly. The admission hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. That is why I agreed to the merger. That is why I tolerated your insults in the boardroom. We are land rich and cash poor. If this deal fails, I can't feed them. I can't protect the territory. It was a stunning moment of vulnerability. The alpha king, the apex predator, was just a CEO, trying to make payroll. You aren't broke because of bad luck, I said, turning my screen toward him. You're broke because you're being bled. I pointed to the data visualization I had just unlocked. Silas isn't just embezzling funds to buy sports cars. He's funneling millions into a series of offshore accounts linked to a holding company in Eastern Europe. But the beneficiary isn't a bank. Kaelen leaned in, his face inches from mine as he read the data. The Iron River Syndicate, he said, his voice dangerously low. They are a rogue pack, mercenaries. They have been trying to encroach on our borders for a decade. He's not just stealing from you, I said, connecting the final dots. He's funding your invasion. He's paying them to take you out so he can install a puppet regime, likely himself. Kaelen's hands clenched into fists, his claws threatening to puncture the mahogany. I will kill him tonight. I will go to his home and end this. No, I said, grabbing his wrist. The contact sent a shockwave through both of us, a jolt of that biological static, but I held on. If you kill him tonight, the money disappears. The Iron River Pack keeps the funds, and the SEC investigates us for murder. We lose everything. Then what is your strategy, consultant? He asked, looking at my hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. The shareholder gala is tomorrow night, I said, a cold plan forming in my mind. Silas will be there. The investors will be there. We don't just fire him. We destroy him publicly. We present the evidence to the board and the police simultaneously. We make his arrest the main event. Kaelen looked at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the smirk of a bully this time. It was the grin of a partner. You want to hunt him in front of the audience. Exactly, I said, releasing his arm. But to do that, we need to look like a united front. We need to sell the merger. If we were going into a war zone, I would have worn fatigues. Since we were walking into a shareholder gala, I wore a gown that cost more than the average annual salary of a mid-level manager. But this wasn't just fashion. It was tactical gear disguised as haute couture. The dress was a midnight blue column of silk that left my shoulders bare but swept the floor in a pool of dark fabric. It was beautiful, but the beauty was secondary to the engineering. Kaelen hadn't sent a stylist. He had sent a defense contractor. The bodice was lined with a microweave ballistic mesh, thin enough to be invisible, but strong enough to stop a small caliber round or a glancing blow from a claw. Strapped to my left thigh, hidden beneath the slit in the skirt, was a compact, high-voltage taser. I adjusted the strap, ensuring the weapon wouldn't print against the fabric. Corporate warfare usually involves lawyers, but tonight I had a feeling the objections would be physical. You look... Kaelen's voice trailed off from the doorway. I turned. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him with the kind of precision that suggested it had been sewn onto his body that morning. The stark black and white formalized his power, taming the wildness of his appearance into something deceptively civilized. He looked like a king. I look like bait, I finished for him, smoothing the silk over the armor. Which is the point. Silas needs to think I'm just a trophy on your arm, not the person holding the detonator to his career. He will underestimate you, Kaelen agreed, stepping into the room. He handed me a small earpiece. But we need clear protocols. The room will be filled with civilians. If Silas realizes he is cornered, he may try to use the crowd as leverage. If he moves, I said, fitting the device into my ear. I signal security to lock the perimeter. We do not engage him physically on the dance floor, Kaelen. I don't care what your wolf wants. If you tear his throat out in front of the board of directors, we go to prison. We need him arrested, not mauled. Fine, he grumbled, adjusting his cufflinks. But if he touches you, the SEC can file whatever complaint they want. I will remove the hand. We established a silent language. A touch to his tie meant the perimeter was compromised. A touch to the small of my back meant I needed to move behind him instantly. A tap on my ear meant legal counsel had arrived. It was a merger of violence and litigation. The arrival at the Thorne Tower atrium was calculated theater. We descended the grand staircase together, my hand resting lightly on his forearm. The muscle beneath the wool was rock hard, vibrating with tension. The room fell silent. It wasn't the polite hush of a cocktail party. It was the instinctual stillness of a forest when a predator enters the clearing. 300 heads turned. The air smelled of expensive perfume, champagne, and fear. I glanced at my phone discreetly. Smile, I whispered. The live stream of our entrance just hit the trading forums. The stock is up 2 points. They like the visuals of a united front. We moved through the crowd, a perfect synchronization of human calculation and wolf instinct. The mate bond Kaelen spoke of ceased to be an abstract legal concept and became a terrifyingly useful radar system. I didn't need to look to know where he was. Even when we separated to work the room, him with the Japanese investors, me with the regulatory board, I felt a phantom tether tugging at my sternum. It was a low hum in the base of my skull, a hyper-awareness that pinpointed his location in the chaos. The tension broke near the bar. A young waiter, trembling under the pressure of serving a room full of apex predators, stumbled. A drop of red wine splashed onto Kaelen's sleeve. The reaction was instantaneous. Kaelen didn't just flinch. He snarled. It was a low, guttural sound that made the nearby guests freeze, their glasses halfway to their mouths. His hand shot out, grabbing the waiter's wrist with enough force to snap bone. The boy went pale, the tray rattling violently. The beast was surfacing, triggered by the stress and the proximity of the enemy. I was there in 3 seconds. I didn't run. Running implies panic. I glided. I placed my hand firmly over Kaelen's clenched fist. The contact was electric, a jolt that grounded the static in the air. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice cool, professional, and loud enough to be heard by the staring circle. "I believe this young man needs to refill the tray, not receive a performance review." Kaelen froze. He looked at my hand, then up at my eyes. The amber light in his irises receded, replaced by the dark intelligence of the man. He blinked, the human intellect regaining control over the wolf's reflex. He released the waiter, who scrambled away as if escaping a fire. "My apologies," Kaelen murmured, straightening his cuff. "Nerves." "He's passionate about service standards," I added smoothly, steering him away from the scene. But my hand lingered on his arm, and I felt his pulse slow down to a human rhythm. Across the room, near the stage, Silas stepped up to the microphone. He wasn't running. He was smiling. Silas tapped the microphone twice. The acoustic feedback was a sharp, piercing whine that cut through the ambient chatter of the gala like a scalpel. The room fell silent, but it wasn't the respectful silence of an audience anticipating a toast. It was the confused, brittle silence of a herd sensing a shift in the wind. Silas stood on the raised platform, bathed in the spotlight, looking every inch the concerned executive. He didn't look at the shareholders. He looked directly at Kaelen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Silas began, his voice amplified and smooth, hiding the treachery beneath a veneer of corporate concern. "We are gathered here to celebrate a union, but I must ask, at what cost? We have seen our stock rise, yes, but we have also seen our traditions trampled. Our Alpha King has not just merged our company, He has sold our sovereignty to a human auditor. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Kaelen stiffen beside me, his muscles coiled, the fabric of his tuxedo straining, as the physical manifestation of his rage began to take over. "He is unfit," Silas declared, his voice dropping the pretense of civility. "And under the ancient laws of the pack, an unfit alpha must be removed." That was the signal. The heavy double doors of the ballroom slammed shut simultaneously. The sound was identical to the boardroom lockdown, the heavy, mechanical thud of magnetic seals engaging. The waiters, positioned around the perimeter, dropped their trays. Champagne flutes shattered on the marble, the sound masking the tearing of fabric as 24 rogue wolves initiated a partial shift. They weren't here to serve drinks. They were a strike team. "Get behind me," Kaelen roared, the sound no longer human. His hands morphed, claws tearing through his expensive gloves. His face elongated, the handsome features contorting into the terrifying muzzle of the beast. Panic erupted. The human investors screamed and scrambled toward the sealed exits, creating a chaotic bottleneck. Kaelen didn't retreat. He launched himself into the center of the room, intercepting 3 rogues who were sprinting toward the stage. The violence was immediate and absolute. It was a blur of fur, blood, and teeth, a primal brawl happening in the middle of a black tie event. I didn't scream. Panic is a non-productive allocation of energy. While Kaelen engaged the physical threat, I identified my objective. The rogues were focused on the alpha. The humans were focused on the doors. No one was watching the audiovisual booth in the corner. I kicked off my heels, tactical necessity, and sprinted through the chaos. A rogue wolf, foaming at the mouth, lunged at me from the left. I didn't stop. I activated the taser strapped to my thigh and drove the prongs into his neck as I passed. He convulsed and dropped. I vaulted over the mixing board and plugged my tablet directly into the master control node. The room was a dual-front war. On the dance floor, Kaelen was a whirlwind of destruction, protecting the innocent bystanders with a brutality that was terrifying to witness. He was dismantling the attackers with efficient, lethal strikes. But up in the booth, I was fighting the real battle. Silas's tech team, likely the same incompetents who ran his security, had put a firewall on the projection system. It took me 12 seconds to bypass it. "Let's see how you spin this," I muttered, hitting the broadcast key. The massive 4K screens behind the stage, which had been displaying the company logo, flickered. The image changed instantly. The gala vanished, replaced by high-resolution scans of Silas's bank statements. The wire transfers to the Iron River Syndicate were highlighted in neon red. The embezzlement scheme was projected 20 feet high for every shareholder, regulator, and journalist to see. The fighting on the floor faltered. The rogue wolves hesitated. Silas turned, his face draining of color, as he saw his secret ledger illuminated in 4K definition. He looked at the screen, then at Kaelen, and finally, his gaze locked on me in the booth. He realized that while the Wolf King could kill him, I was the one who had already ended his life. He bared his teeth, ignored the alpha, and charged straight for the server room. The door to the server room didn't just open, it dissolved under the impact of a desperate creature. Wood laminate and drywall exploded inward, creating a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the entry. I didn't scream. Screaming wastes oxygen, and I needed every molecule of air to steady my hand. I retreated into the narrow aisle between the humming server racks, positioning myself so that Silas would have to funnel through the choke point. I wasn't a soldier, but I understood fatal funnels. Silas emerged from the debris. He was in a transitional state, half man, half nightmare. His jaw was distended, rows of serrated teeth dripping with saliva, and his eyes were burning with the madness of a cornered animal. He didn't care about the merger or the money anymore. He wanted to erase the source of his exposure. He wanted me. "You ruined it," he rasped, the words distorted by his elongated vocal cords. He lunged. I didn't run. I raised my right hand. I wasn't holding a weapon of war, but a canister of pressurized aerosol I had synthesized in the lab 3 days ago. Wolfsbane extract suspended in a pepper spray base. A botanical deterrent for a biological problem. I depressed the actuator. A thick orange cloud engulfed his face. The effect was instantaneous and chemical. Silas roared, a sound that turned into a wet, choking cough. He clawed at his eyes, stumbling back into a server rack. The heavy metal unit groaned and sparked as his weight crushed the delicate hardware. But he was an alpha-tier wolf. His pain tolerance was supernatural. He shook his head, sneezing out the toxin, and fixed one watering, hateful eye on me. He swiped blindly. The tip of a claw caught the sleeve of my dress, shredding the silk and scoring a thin red line across my upper arm. The pain was sharp, hot, and clarifying. He prepared to lunge again, ready to close the distance and finish the job. Then the wall behind him vanished. It wasn't an explosion. It was an interception. Kaelen hit Silas with the kinetic energy of a freight train. The impact carried both of them across the room, slamming Silas into the far wall with enough force to crack the concrete foundation. Kaelen didn't give him a chance to recover. He was a blur of violence, pinning the traitor to the floor. His hand, now a massive clawed paw, clamped around Silas's throat, cutting off his air. Kaelen raised his other hand, claws fully extended, poised to drive them directly into Silas's chest. It was an execution stroke. The beast was in control. The Alpha King was going to resolve this conflict the ancient way. "Stop!" My voice cracked through the room like a whip. It wasn't a plea. It was a direct order. Kaelen froze. His claws were millimeters from Silas's skin. His entire body was vibrating, a terrifying tremor of muscles fighting against momentum. He turned his head slowly, looking at me with eyes that were entirely amber, devoid of humanity. He snarled, a low warning that said, "Stay back." "If you kill him," I said, stepping forward, ignoring the blood trickling down my arm, "we lose the witness. We lose the testimony. The SEC will view a corpse as a cover-up, Kaelen. Dead men don't sign confessions." He growled, the sound rattling the remaining servers. The instinct to kill was overwhelming. He wanted vengeance. He wanted to eliminate the threat to his mate. "Look at me," I commanded, walking until I was standing directly over them. "You are not an animal. You are a CEO. Think about the asset. Think about the legacy. If you kill him, he wins. He destroys your reputation from the grave." I pointed to the door. "Let security take him. We handle this by the book." For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the high-pitched whine of a damaged cooling fan. Kaelen stared at me, the amber fire warring with the dark intelligence I knew was buried beneath the fur. He looked at Silas, who was gasping for air, then back at me. He looked at the cut on my arm, and his nostrils flared. Then, slowly, agonizingly, he pulled his hand back. He stood up, shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed against his restraint. He grabbed Silas by the back of the neck and hauled him up, throwing him toward the doorway just as the company security team, humans with tasers, burst in. "Get him out of my sight," Kaelen roared, his voice human but distorted. "Before I change my mind." Silas was dragged away, broken and defeated. In the ballroom, the rogue wolves, seeing their leader spared and taken into custody by humans, dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees, baring their necks. They weren't surrendering to the security guards. They were surrendering to the realization that the Alpha King had just obeyed a human woman. The hierarchy had shifted. Logic had conquered instinct. We retreated to the executive suite, bypassing the chaotic triage in the lobby. When the elevator doors opened, Kaelen collapsed onto the leather sofa in the lounge area. He didn't fall, he just ceased to hold himself upright with the rigid posture of a king. The adrenaline was fading, and the damage was becoming visible. His tuxedo shirt was ruined, soaked through with dark blood where a rogue's claws had raked across his ribs during the melee. 2 paramedics, nervous betas from the company clinic, hovered in the doorway, terrified to approach. Kaelen let out a low, warning growl when one of them took a step forward with a syringe. His eyes were still flashing that dangerous amber, his instincts dialed up to maximum lethality. He didn't recognize them as healers. He recognized them as strangers invading his den while he was vulnerable. "Get out," he snarled, the sound wet and ragged. "Mr. Thorne, you've lost a significant volume of fluid," the medic stammered, clutching a trauma kit. "Leave the kit," I ordered, stepping between the paramedics and the Alpha. I held out my hand. "Clear the floor. I will handle the triage. The medic looked at me, then at the growling monster on the couch, and made the logical choice. He handed me the bag and fled. I walked to the sofa and set the kit on the coffee table. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't offer comfort. I simply picked up the medical shears and cut the ruined shirt away from his torso. The wound was ugly. 3 deep lacerations tracking along the intercostal muscles. But his accelerated healing factor was already trying to knit the edges together. The problem was that the wounds were dirty. Shreds of silk and debris were trapped in the clotting blood. "This is going to sting," I said, uncapping a bottle of antiseptic. "But given your performance downstairs, I assume your pain tolerance is within acceptable parameters." Kaelen hissed as I poured the liquid over the wound, his hands gripping the leather cushions until the material tore. But he didn't pull away. He watched my face as I worked, his gaze intense and unfaltering. The physical intimacy of the moment was undeniable. I was touching him, my hands slick with his blood, cleaning him with a precision that was usually reserved for my spreadsheets. The mate bond wasn't just a legal clause anymore. It was a tangible circuit closing between us. I could feel his pain as a dull ache in my own side. I could feel his exhaustion as a weight in my own limbs. "You realize what happened down there," Kaelen said, his voice rough but steady. It wasn't a question. I paused, holding a sterile gauze pad against his ribs. "We neutralized the threat. We secured the company." "No," he corrected, reaching up to cover my hand with his. His skin was burning hot. I was in the red. I was in the killing state. An alpha in that state does not stop. It is biologically impossible. The instinct to destroy the challenger overrides all higher cognitive function. I looked at him, analyzing the data. "But you did stop." "I stopped because you ordered me to," he said, his thumb brushing the pulse point on my wrist. "My wolf didn't hear a consultant. He heard a command from a superior authority. By obeying you over my own instinct, I effectively ceded the hierarchy." I pulled my hand back, the implication hitting me harder than the sight of the blood. "I am not a wolf, Kaelen. I am a human auditor. I cannot hold rank in your pack." "You already do," he murmured, leaning his head back against the cushion, his eyes closing. "You aren't just the mate. You are the alpha female. You didn't just merge the companies tonight. You annexed the king." I stood up, wiping my hands on a towel, my heart rate spiking. This wasn't a promotion. It was a catastrophe. I had spent 10 years building a reputation based on impartial analysis and objective distance. I couldn't be impartial if I was biologically wired to the CEO. I couldn't audit a company if I was spiritually married to its leadership. The mating wasn't a partnership. It was a conflict of interest so severe it would get me disbarred from every consulting firm in the hemisphere. I looked at Kaelen, who was finally drifting into a healing sleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically. He looked peaceful for the first time since I'd met him. He thought the problem was solved. He thought the bond was settled. I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. The logic was inescapable. I had saved the company, but I had compromised my own professional integrity. I couldn't stay. The variables had changed, and the new equation didn't balance. I went to my desk, the glass desk in the center of the room, and pulled up a blank document. I didn't hesitate. I began to type. To the Board of Directors. From the Acting COO. Immediate resignation due to irreconcilable conflict of interest. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. It was a stark, clinical light, perfect for ending things. I placed my resignation letter on the low coffee table between us. It was drafted on company letterhead, concise, legally binding, and completely devoid of emotion. It stated that, due to a compromise in professional objectivity following the events of the gala, I was exercising my right to immediate severance. Kaelen sat across from me, his torso bandaged but his posture regained. The feral desperation of the previous night had been replaced by the cool, calculated demeanor of the CEO. He picked up the letter, read the single paragraph, and then set it back down without a flicker of irritation. "Denied," he said simply. "It's not a request, Kaelen," I replied, sipping my coffee. "It's a notification. I cannot audit a company when I am sleeping with the CEO. It violates every ethics clause in my certification. The conflict of interest is absolute." "A conflict of interest only exists if the parties have opposing goals," he countered. He reached into his briefcase, which had survived the gala better than my dress, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folio. He slid it across the marble surface. "If the entities are merged, the conflict vanishes. It becomes synergy." I opened the folio. It wasn't a separation agreement. It was an executive contract, but the terms were unlike anything I had ever seen in the corporate world. It was titled the Thorne Pack Governance Restructuring Agreement. I scanned the clauses, my eyebrows climbing higher with every paragraph. Clause 1. The acting consultant is granted full operational sovereignty over all non-combat assets, encompassing logistics, finance, and personnel management. Clause 2. Veto power over all strategic military deployments, ensuring no wars are started without fiscal approval. Clause 3. 50% equity in the Thorne estate, irrevocable and vested immediately upon signature. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an abdication of absolute power. "You're offering me half your kingdom," I said, looking up at him, searching for the catch. "And absolute control over your army's budget." "I'm offering you a partnership," he corrected, his voice dropping to that persuasive rumble. "You said my way was outdated. You said I ruled like a feudal dictator and it was bankrupting us. You were right. The pack needs a modern infrastructure to survive this century. It needs a queen who understands leverage, not just violence. It needs you." He leaned forward, his amber eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavy. "The mate bond isn't just about biology, consultant. It's nature's way of ensuring the strongest possible leadership team. You bring the logic. I bring the teeth. We don't compete. We integrate. That isn't a conflict of interest. That is a monopoly." I looked back down at the document, analyzing the variables. He was right. From a purely career perspective, this was the ultimate promotion. I wasn't just being hired. I was being installed as the co-ruler of a supernatural sovereign nation with a multi-billion-dollar corporate front. The benefits package was unprecedented. An extended lifespan, perfect health, rapid cellular regeneration, and a private security force that could dismantle a tank. The golden handcuffs were literal, implying a lifetime commitment, but the keys were firmly in my pocket. "This clause regarding biological exclusivity and dynastic succession," I noted, tapping the page with my fingernail. "That's the marriage license?" "It's the merger ratification," he said, a ghost of a smirk appearing on his face, "and it is non-negotiable." I analyzed the risk profile one last time. High danger, high stress, potential for violent death by rogue wolves. But the ROI was incalculable. I would never have to answer to a board of directors again. I would be the board. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. I pulled a Mont Blanc pen from my blazer pocket. "I accept the position," I said, my voice steady. "But I have conditions. First, no more eating hardware in the server room. I want the IT department civilized. Second, we implement a proper HR department to handle disputes without bloodshed. And third," I signed my name with a flourish, the ink binding me to the Alpha King forever. "If you ever growl at me in a board meeting again, I invoke the veto clause and cut your budget." Kaelen watched the ink dry, satisfaction radiating off him in heat waves. "Agreed," he said. "Welcome to the pack." The restructuring of Thorne Dynamics was less of a reorganization and more of a cultural exorcism. My first official act as the newly minted alpha female, a title I accepted only for its administrative clearance levels, was to terminate the Gamma who ran the logistics division. He attempted to challenge me to a ritual duel for his position. I declined the physical combat and instead presented him with a forensic audit of his expense reports, highlighting 3 years of tax fraud. He didn't bare his throat. He signed the severance agreement and fled the state. It was a bloodless victory, and it set the tone for the new regime. In his place, I hired a supply chain expert from a Fortune 500 logistics firm. She was a human woman standing 5'2", with no supernatural abilities other than an uncanny talent for optimizing shipping routes. The pack was baffled. They watched her navigate the warehouse with a clipboard, terrified not of her physical strength, but of her efficiency. They had learned quickly that under my command, a bad performance review was more lethal than a bite. Kaelen found this transition endlessly amusing. He spent his mornings leaning over the mezzanine railing, watching his warriors scramble to file their timesheets correctly. To him, seeing a 300-pound enforcer sweating over a data entry error was high comedy. He told me later that my approach had introduced a new kind of fear to the pack, the fear of incompetence. I reorganized the physical space of the den as well. The dark, cave-like atmosphere was replaced with proper lighting and ergonomic furniture. Marcus, the Delta who ate hardware, was reassigned to the perimeter security team, where his dental fixation could be used on trespassers rather than servers. The IT department was restaffed with professionals who understood that crashing the system wasn't a literal instruction. I found myself enjoying the synergy. When a vendor attempted to strong-arm us on a steel contract, I didn't just cite market rates. I let a subtle, predatory edge slip into my voice, a mimicry of Kaelen's tone, and watched the man pale and capitulate. Having the backing of a werewolf pack gave my negotiations a weight that no amount of legal precedent could match. It was a heady feeling, knowing that while I used logic as my primary weapon, I have a nuclear option waiting in the lobby if the conversation failed. However, the merger of our private lives required a more delicate negotiation. Kaelen assumed that the signing of the governance contract implied immediate cohabitation in the penthouse master suite. I viewed this as a procedural error. We stood in the hallway outside the double doors of his quarters, the tension between us shifting from professional to domestic. "The contract is signed," Kaelen argued, leaning against the doorframe with a casual arrogance that was irritatingly attractive. "Integration is the next logical step. The pack expects us to share a den." "The pack also expects raw meat for lunch, and I changed that policy," I countered, crossing my arms. "We are in the due diligence phase of the relationship, Kaelen. I require a probationary period to assess compatibility variables, snoring volume, temperature preferences, and duvet distribution. 30 days. I will take the guest suite." He laughed, a low rumble that I felt in the soles of my feet. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, not to intimidate, but to entice. "You can have your 30 days, consultant, but my wolf is impatient. He doesn't understand probation." "Then teach him patience," I said, holding my ground. "Or I sleep at a hotel." He conceded, but the look in his eyes suggested he viewed the timeline as a challenge to be beaten. We were rewriting the rules of the pack, one clause at a time. But the bedroom was one territory he intended to conquer. He smirked, turned the key to the guest room for me, and whispered that he enjoyed a difficult audit. Returning to the boardroom where this entire operation began felt less like a meeting and more like a victory lap around a conquered track. The setting was identical to the day I had slid the termination notice across the mahogany. The same panoramic view of the city skyline, the same scent of polished wood and recycled air, and the same heavy, soundproof doors. However, the atmospheric pressure within the room had undergone a complete inversion. The variables had shifted so drastically that the air practically vibrated with the new status quo. 3 weeks ago, I had walked into this room as a liability to be liquidated. Today, I walked in as the controlling interest. I moved to the head of the table. In the previous administration, Kaelen's administration, this chair had been the throne of the alpha, a seat of absolute, unquestioned dominance. When I approached it, the room went deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on the leather upholstery, waiting to see if the hierarchy would hold. Kaelen didn't challenge me. He didn't growl. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled the chair out for me. It was a gesture that appeared chivalrous to the uninitiated, but to the wolves in the room, it was a seismic signal. The Alpha King was publicly ceding the seat of governance to his mate. He was acknowledging that while he ruled the bodies of the pack, I ruled the infrastructure. I sat. Kaelen took the seat at my right hand, leaning back with a relaxed, predatory grace that suggested he was merely a spectator at his own execution. He wasn't, of course. He was simply enjoying the terror I was inflicting on his subordinates. The board was a fascinating study in dual-spectrum fear. On the left side of the table sat the human executives, the VPs of marketing, legal, and finance. They were terrified of Kaelen. They had seen the footage from the gala. They knew that the man in the bespoke suit could turn into a creature that shredded steel. They flinched every time he shifted in his chair, sweating through their dress shirts despite the climate control. On the right side sat the wolf executives, the pack elders who managed territories and enforcement. They weren't looking at Kaelen. They were looking at me. They were terrified of the woman who had exiled the Gamma with a spreadsheet. They knew that while Kaelen might break their bones for disobedience, I could freeze their assets, revoke their clearances, and dismantle their legacies with a single signature. Kaelen offered physical pain, which they understood and respected. I offered bureaucratic erasure, which was a horror beyond their comprehension. "Let's bring this meeting to order," I said, placing the final merger documents on the table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was the only noise in the room. "We are here to ratify the Thorne Pack Governance Restructuring Agreement. You have all had 24 hours to review the addendums regarding the new compliance protocols." I looked down the row of wolves. "Director Vance, I noticed you hesitated on the clause regarding mandatory anger management seminars for the enforcement division. Do you have an objection to the new policy?" Vance, a scarred wolf who had likely killed men with his bare hands, swallowed hard. He looked at me, then flicked his eyes briefly to Kaelen, hoping for support. Kaelen just smiled, a sharp, toothy expression that offered no sanctuary. "No objection, ma'am," Vance rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. "The protocol allows for greater operational discretion." "Excellent," I said, turning to the human side. "Mr. Henderson, legal. Are the liability shields in place for the new personnel security program?" Henderson adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers. "Yes, ironclad. We've classified the pack activities under proprietary security methodologies. It's creative, but legal." "Then we proceed to the vote," I announced. "All in favor of the merger and the new leadership structure." The response was instantaneous. Every hand in the room went up. There was no hesitation, no political maneuvering, and certainly no growling. It was the most efficient board vote in the history of the corporation. The fear of God, or rather, the fear of the alpha couple, had streamlined the democratic process beautifully. "The motion carries," I said, signing the document with a final authoritative stroke. "The merger is ratified. Thorne Dynamics is now solvent, secure, and under new management. Meeting adjourned." The executives scrambled to leave as if the room were on fire. Papers were shoved into briefcases, laptops were snapped shut, and the room cleared in under 45 seconds. Kaelen and I remained alone in the sudden quiet. He stood up slowly, walking behind my chair. His hands came to rest on my shoulders, his thumbs pressing into the tension knots at the base of my neck. The professional distance was gone, replaced by the heavy electric heat of the bond. "You terrified them," he murmured, his mouth close to my ear. "My warriors were shaking. I've never been more aroused." "It's called competence, Kaelen," I replied, leaning back slightly into his touch despite my better judgment. "It's very effective." "The public merger is signed," he whispered, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating growl that sent a shiver down my spine. "The boardroom is closed. Now we discuss the private merger, and I don't intend to let you hide behind a spreadsheet for this negotiation." The elevator ascent to the penthouse was silent. The probationary period I had negotiated regarding our living arrangements seemed legally flimsy in the face of the unanimous board vote. We had ratified the union. The paperwork was filed. Now came the operational integration. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was bathed in the twilight of the city below. It was a space of stark contrasts, steel and glass meeting fir throws and unpolished wood. It was the architectural embodiment of the man standing beside me, a modern fortress built to house something ancient. Kaelen walked to the center of the room, loosening his tie with a slow, deliberate motion. He tossed his jacket onto a chair, the sound of the expensive fabric hitting the leather echoing in the silence. He turned to face me, the city lights framing his silhouette. The Alpha King was no longer playing the role of the CEO. The mask of civility had slipped, revealing the raw, possessive intent underneath. "The board has spoken," he said, his voice a low rumble that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my chest. "The merger is ratified. The 30-day waiting period is inefficient." I stepped into the room, the heels of my shoes clicking against the hardwood. I stopped 5 feet from him, maintaining the illusion of a negotiation. "You are citing a loophole, Mr. Thorne. The ratification was corporate. The domestic contract is a separate entity." "There is no separation," he countered, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. He stopped inches from me, the heat radiating from his body, mocking the climate control. "You know it. You felt it in the boardroom. When you took the chair, you didn't just take the company. You took the pack. And by taking the pack, you claimed the alpha." He reached out, his hand cupping my cheek. His thumb brushed over my pulse point, which was betraying my composed exterior with a rapid, staccato rhythm. "My wolf doesn't understand separate entities. He only understands mine." I looked up at him, analyzing the variables. The logic held. I had spent the last 48 hours dismantling his enemies, restructuring his hierarchy, and binding my legal fate to his. To deny the physical culmination of that alliance was no longer a strategic delay. It was cowardice. And I didn't build my career on fear. "You're right," I admitted, my voice steady despite the proximity. "The data supports immediate integration." Kaelen didn't smile. He lowered his head, his lips brushing the shell of my ear. "Then stop analyzing, consultant, and start ruling." The kiss wasn't tentative. It was a hostile takeover of my senses. It was demanding, absolute, and terrifyingly thorough. The professional barriers I had constructed, the walls of logic, the moats of sarcasm, the shields of procedure, didn't just crumble. They were incinerated. He lifted me effortlessly, setting me on the edge of the heavy oak table, displacing a stack of architectural blueprints. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The plans for the future were literally being rewritten by the present reality. This wasn't the romance of a paperback novel. It was the collision of 2 apex predators finding their equal. His hands were rough, possessive, mapping the territory he had fought for. My hands tangled in his hair, grounding the storm. There was a desperate synergy to it, a frantic need to bridge the gap between his world of instinct and my world of order. "You handle the logic," he growled against my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, a promise of the mark that would come. "I handle the violence." That was the deal. "It's a synthesis," I corrected, breathless, my head falling back as he pressed a kiss to the hollow of my throat. "We are the balance." When he finally claimed me, not with a signature on a document, but with the primal, biological bond of his species, it felt like the final piece of a complex equation clicking into place. As the night wore on, the lines between the consultant and the queen blurred until they were indistinguishable. I realized, lying there in the aftermath of the merger, that I hadn't just stayed for the salary, or the power, or the challenge. I had stayed because for 10 years I had been the smartest person in every room, and it was lonely. I had finally found the one variable I couldn't predict, the one force I couldn't control, and the one partner who didn't want me to shrink. He didn't want a subordinate. He wanted a co-pilot. Kaelen pulled me closer, his arm a heavy weight across my waist, his breathing syncing with mine. "No more running," he murmured into the darkness. "The contract is sealed." "No more running," I agreed, closing my eyes. "But I'm still reviewing the quarterly budget tomorrow." He chuckled, the sound vibrating through both of us. "I wouldn't expect anything less." 90 days is the standard probationary period for any new corporate acquisition. It is the time frame in which systems are stress-tested, redundancies are eliminated, and the new culture is cemented. At Thorne Dynamics, the 90-day mark didn't just bring stability. It brought a 40% increase in net revenue and a significant decrease in accidental property damage. The den was no longer a chaotic clubhouse for supernatural brawlers. It was a precision instrument of corporate warfare. I stood at the window of my office, the glass soundproofed against the city noise, but not entirely against the commotion in the outer corridor. I was currently on a conference call with the alpha of the Blackwood Pack, a rival CEO who was under the mistaken impression that he could encroach on our southern distribution territories because our leadership had gone soft. "Ms. Thorne," the Blackwood alpha barked over the speakerphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't think you understand the old laws. Territory isn't held by contracts. It's held by strength. If Kaelen won't come to the border to defend it, we will simply take it." I took a sip of my espresso, watching the reflection in the glass. Behind me, the heavy oak door to my office shuddered violently. There was a muffled thud, the distinct sound of a heavy body hitting drywall, followed by a low, wet growl. "Mr. Blackwood," I replied, my voice perfectly even, "I believe you are confusing softness with efficiency. Kaelen isn't at the border because deploying a CEO to handle a boundary dispute is a misuse of executive time. We have a legal team for that. And frankly, your encroachment constitutes a breach of the 1998 Treaty of Shadows." Another crash from the hallway. This time, the sound of splintering wood accompanied it. A rogue assassin from a splinter faction had bypassed the lobby security 5 minutes ago. I hadn't called the police. I had simply pressed the silent alarm on my desk, which paged Kaelen directly. "Treaties are paper," Blackwood sneered. "I'm sending a raiding party tonight." "I wouldn't recommend that," I said, tapping a key on my tablet to forward a file to his secure server. "I've just emailed you a forensic breakdown of your pack's shell companies. If a single wolf crosses our border, I forward this data to the IRS and the Council of Elders. You'll be fighting an audit and a court-martial simultaneously. That is a war on 2 fronts you cannot afford." Silence on the other end. The threat of financial ruin was often more terrifying to modern alphas than the threat of physical violence. "We will review the data," Blackwood muttered, and the line went dead. I placed the phone down just as my office door opened. It didn't open smoothly, it was kicked open. Kaelen stood in the frame. He had removed his suit jacket, and his white dress shirt was rolled up to the elbows. His hands were stained with something dark that definitely wasn't printer ink, and there was a smear of drywall dust on his cheek. He was breathing hard, the amber light in his eyes slowly fading back to human brown. Behind him, 2 members of the new janitorial staff, specialists in biohazard cleanup, were already moving efficiently down the hall with a rolling cart. "The negotiation?" Kaelen asked, walking into the room and heading straight for the wet bar. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. "Resolved," I said, walking over to him. Blackwood retreated. He realized that bankruptcy is more painful than a beating. "And your meeting?" "The intruder was enthusiastic," Kaelen said, wiping his mouth. "But he lacked a coherent strategy. He is currently being processed by security." I reached out and picked a splinter of wood from his shoulder. "You got blood on the carpet in the hallway." "I'll have it replaced," he murmured, pulling me into his space. The scent of violence still clung to him, ozone, musk, and iron, but it was layered over the expensive cologne I had bought him. It was the scent of our partnership, civilized on the surface, lethal underneath. "They say you tamed me," he whispered, resting his forehead against mine. "The investors, the pack. They think the consultant put a leash on the wolf." "They're wrong," I replied, smoothing the collar of his shirt. "I didn't tame you, Kaelen. Taming implies suppressing your nature. I didn't want a pet. I wanted a weapon that knew where to aim. I just gave you a better targeting system." He chuckled, the vibration running through my chest. We turned and looked out at the skyline, the city lights reflecting in the glass. We were the new management. We had replaced the chaotic brutality of the old world with the cold, hard logic of the new one, and business was booming. I reached up and adjusted Kaelen's tie, tightening the Windsor knot until it was perfectly symmetrical. It was a reminder. He might be the king, but I controlled the presentation. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, I said, handing him his jacket. "Try not to intimidate the interns." "No promises," he smirked. "If you want to see the performance review for the next quarter, subscribe to the channel. Class dismissed.